Good evening and welcome to the Malcontent News hosted virtual event, COVID variant Omicron, a panel discussion on fact, fiction, and fantasy. My name is David Obelts and I am the Chief Content Officer of Malcontent News. We are independent journalists who focus on equity, health, BIPOC, and the LGBTQIA community. You could visit our website at malcontentnews.com or by using the Google News app on iOS and Android devices. We will start today's webinar with a land acknowledgement. Malcontent News would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the First Peoples of King County, including the Duwamish, Snoqualmie, and Muckleshoot peoples, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the First Nations of all of the Americas. Before we continue, I have a few housekeeping items for you. First, some tips for the best experience. The quality of the webinar is only as good as the worst connection between you and our presenters. You can resolve most connection issues by exiting and rejoining the webinar. This chat is moderated. We support civil and respectful discourse during the webinar. We have a mild content warning. We have two panelists today who will be discussing their experiences from having COVID. I would also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand next week. We will be taking questions from our panelists for a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. You can submit your questions in the group chat or via email at webinar.questions@badenhillgroup.com. That's webinar.questions@badenhillgroup.com. And I have one more piece of housekeeping before we get started. The information, including but not limited to text, graphics, images, videos, and other materials provided in this webinar are for informational purposes only. No content in this webinar should be intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have read or heard in this webinar. And it is now my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. Melanie Matthew has her PhD in immunology. She is CEO and research scientist with cross-disciplinary experience in immunology, chemistry, biophysics, and molecular biology. She's an author of 19 publications, including books and chapters in novel immune system imaging methods. She worked on the first two photon imaging system used to characterize immune cell response in vivo to pathogens, and is a company founder and CEO with over 20 filed patents and has raised $30 million. TJ Pax Hardy is a field epidemiologist and outbreak critical strike team program manager who has been on the front lines of the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic for almost 2 years. He is an expert in viral and outbreak prevention and mitigation. He worked with the United States Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization in Thailand to end the Japanese encephalitis epidemic. He is an environmental pathogenic remediation expert. Next is Dr. Zachary Rubin, MD. He is an allergy and clinical immunologist. He is an expert regarding adverse reactions to vaccines and serves on a school board district medical advisory board. Next, we have Donna Lurie. Ethan Soraka had an emergency come up and is not able to join us today, and Donna is substituting. She is the board president of NAMI Eastside, and she is experienced in coaching people with mental health and substance abuse in the workplace. She is an independent mediator, arbiter, and trainer for Lurie Workplace Solutions, and she is trained in NAMI Homefront, NAMI Sparks, building resilience, and crisis prevention and intervention. Next, we have Dr. Todd Wolin. He is the MD. He is the CEO of Kids Plus Pediatric. He is the co-founder of Shots Heard Round the World, an organization that works against COVID misinformation. He is a senior advisor for the Public Goods Project. He did clinical vaccine research for 14 years, and he has been a researcher into medical disinformation since 2017. Next, we have Lindsay Alexander, formerly with the CIA. She is an OSINT and disinformation specialist. She has 10 years in U.S. intelligence community, including the CIA's Directorate of Operations. And she has her MS degree in strategic intelligence from the National Intelligence University. We also have today Beth Pardo. She is a COVID survivor and a long COVID advocate. She's a former ultramarathoner. She had mild COVID infection during the original wave before vaccines were available. And she's had 21 months of experiencing the long-term impact of a mild COVID infection and condition known as long COVID. And finally, we have Natalie Keller, registered nurse. Natalie was hospitalized while pregnant with COVID, delivered her baby prematurely, and had to be put on a ventilator. She is a wife and mother of 4. She has 10 years experience as an RN in bedside oncology, and she was hospitalized for 70 days due to COVID. And with all of that, we're going to go ahead and swap things over back to me. Or at least I think we are, because it seems as though we're all looking at Donna, so you forgive the technical difficulties for the moment. Well, I am going to keep moving while we sort out the camera issues. That was our introductions. To get things started, we have a secret question for our panelists. And at this point, I'd like all of our panelists to remind you to unmute so you can answer our secret question. What is a treat that you reserve for only the holiday season that brought you joy last month?
All right, I guess I'll go first. I'm Melanie Matthew. Thank you for that great introduction. I love just baked apples. It's a weird thing, I know, but I love baked apples with cinnamon and sugar, and it is my favorite holiday treat.
Zachary, what about you?
Oh, that's easy for me. I love hot chocolate. I'm a sucker for sweets, but I always reserve hot chocolate for this time of the year.
Lindsay, why don't we have you go next? What is your guilty pleasure over the holidays?
Oh, it's very similar to Zachary. I like peppermint hot chocolate, though, and I reserve that to Christmas time.
Lindsay, I like how you roll there. Todd, out there in Pittsburgh, how about you?
Yeah, I would say eating multiple different cookies in one day. I don't usually do that, but my wife and daughter were really going to town on baking multiple varieties, and I decided it was important that I had one of each. So there you go.
Beth, you're north of the border up there in Canada. How about you? What's your guilty holiday food pleasure?
Yeah, I didn't think this question was specific to food. So my guilty pleasure during the holidays is the Muppet Christmas Carol. I feel like it really showcases Kermit as an actor. He does well with Dickens. Hands down, Muppet Christmas Carol.
That's fantastic. Pax, what about you?
Oh, for me, it would have to be eggnog. I don't know why, but eggnog is fantastic in December.
I am also a eggnog addict for that. Donna, how about you?
I agree with Beth. You don't have to eat to get a treat. So my family and I love going to the light display at the Bellevue Botanical Gardens.
Oh, that is fantastic. That's a great one. Natalie, bring us home on those treats. What is your guilty pleasure treat?
It would have to be my sister's famous cookies. They're like made with Snickers and peanut butter and sugar, lots of sugar.
Lots of great
Sounds
things. Good. I know not to go to all of your houses at the same time. unless I want to watch the Muppet movie, Christmas movie, and gain 10 pounds. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get the main part of the presentation started. I want to thank everybody again for their answers. On November 8th, a scientist in Botswana doing genomic sequencing of COVID samples noticed 3 highly mutated cases in a group of diplomats who had returned from South Africa. 3 days later, Dr. Shakule Moyo shared his discovery on GSAD. Days later in South Africa, Lancet Labs started seeing a dramatic increase in COVID tests that had S-gene target failures. Less than 2 weeks later, cases of the unusual variant were growing exponentially. On November 24, working with Dr. Alex Segal and other scientific researchers, the South Africa Department of Health submitted its findings to the World Health Organization. And 2 days later, the WHO designated the new variant, Omicron, variant of concern. As of today, the 7-day moving average for confirmed new COVID cases in the United States is over 425,000, about 1.6 million tests being done daily. 98,000 people are hospitalized, the same level as February 4 and September 11. Hospitalizations are growing at about 30% every 14 days, and models predict we will be at a peak in another 2 to 5 weeks. With that said, Melanie, I want to start with you. Why is Omicron so different from previous variants?
Right. So it's a highly mutated variant of SARS-CoV-2. There's about 50 amino acid changes overall throughout the protein structure of the virus. There's about 36 to 37, depending on how you count a deletion in the spike protein itself. And 15 of those are in what's called the receptor binding domain, the domain of the S protein that binds the ACE2 receptor. And that is a place where our antibodies that are good at blocking infection really tend to mitigate viral entry into the cell. So it's a highly mutated version of the virus. It has a lot of immune escape. About 30% of B cell epitopes have been changed, and I can explain what that is later, relative to gamma, delta, and beta, which is about 10 to 15%.
Thank you so much for that. Pax, you've hunted COVID now for almost 2 years in Colorado. What trends are you seeing in the epidemiology, and is it outcompeting public health measures that have worked in the past?
Certainly is. So on the 30th of December in the state of Colorado, we had 9,036 new cases of COVID. We just got the numbers in for today. We have 14,391 new cases as of today. So we are growing each and every day. We're behind in testing because we are seeing an increased number of tests. So we are having a significant challenge in that some of our testing is 2 weeks behind throughout the state. And there are several other states that are also experiencing that, including the state of Washington. So we're seeing pretty significant increases in infection. Beyond that, I've led outbreak response globally in places like Sierra Leone and Thailand with some pretty nasty viruses, and I've never seen anything spread quite so rapidly. I was part of the 2019 measles response for the outbreaks that occurred in the United States. And again, nothing I've ever seen has spread quite so fast. Beyond that, Omicron symptoms are somewhat different. The two that we're seeing that are really new are vomiting and loss of appetite, which are relatively interesting. And beyond that, we just, like I said, we're having a really hard time keeping up with testing.
Melanie, I want to go back to you on that because of this incredible spread that this has. What is driving Omicron to spread so quickly and the breakthrough on the resources and measures that used to work?
Yeah, well, it's a combination of what I started out talking about there, which is the immune evasion, right? So if you've had prior exposure to SARS-CoV-2 and or vaccination, Omicron's able to get around it very easily. So we're seeing a lot higher number of breakthrough cases, and these people are now much more contagious than they were before. There are also higher viral loads, it seems, in the upper respiratory tract, and that can facilitate spread of the virus.
Thank you so much for that. Todd, there's been a lot of headlines in the last 2 weeks, and Omicron is sickening and hospitalizing a record number of children. And you're in a hot spot. What are you seeing?
Yeah, we're in Western Pennsylvania. Our cases are twice as high as they were at the peak of the surge in last winter. We are seeing more cases in the outpatient setting in my office, but hospitalized patients are going up as well. We haven't seen less than 100,000 pediatric cases in a week since the summer, and we're now seeing over 200,000 cases per week. And the average hospitalizations per day for kids are about 300 per day, which is at any one day as of last week, it was about 2,100 patients, which was up 110% from just the week before. So,
and those numbers you're talking about are COVID.
Yeah.
Beth, you were one of the first people to get COVID in Canada. Can you tell us about your life before COVID and what your infection was like?
Sure. So I was a marathoner who had also completed a couple of ultra marathons. I was very active. I would get up at 4:30 in the morning. I did Orange Theory, very healthy, in great shape, no medical conditions at all. And I went into a grocery store on March 24th, 2020, and happened to bump into an infected employee and developed symptoms 10 days later. Knew immediately that it was COVID, even though it was so early on. The symptoms were so distinct. It was a dry, heavy cough, and extreme weakness. COVID really attacked my legs in a mean way. So I was in bed for 17 days. I could barely walk to the bathroom. I laid perfectly still, and I would tell my husband I felt like I needed everything in my body to fight the virus. There were no tests in my area. There was a shortage. I called public health. I was told to stay home unless I was gasping for air. So I didn't go to the doctor. I didn't go to the hospital. I was told literally just stay home and contain it unless you desperately had to go to the hospital. So I was sick for 17 days. And after 17 days, I tried to get out of bed, and I was still pretty weak. And I ended up in bed for 3 months. And that 3 months has now turned into 21 months.
A couple of things I want to say. Malcontent News, for people who follow us know, we generally have an editorial policy of not having people who are victims or have experienced trauma come in and talk about their trauma. I just want to clarify, if people are like, what's going on with the editorial here? Beth is an advocate. She is very open about her condition. She knew the script questions in advance, and she is here to share her story. And I want to preface that because it also leads into my next question. Lindsay, there are people who are just going to dismiss Beth's story. They're going to call her a crisis actress. Where did this come from? Where did this disinformation start?
That's a good question. A lot of what we're seeing now has come from mostly foreign actors and how they're taking advantage of this particular situation that we're in. And with how social media is, especially nowadays, and how quick the algorithms work and how quick it spreads, one of the key elements of disinformation is evoking an emotion. And with that, like on social media, and we're seeing this in real time, is that people will share emotional content. They will like and share it, thereby spreading that disinformation further and having folks tend to believe certain elements of that disinformation and not take the time to properly vet it or look into it further. And so, with that spread and with social media and how those types of emotional content spreads, that disinformation is just taking off, and it can just spread in the blink of a second. It can spread to millions of people, which is a little scary sometimes.
And is this why we started off with a very united front for the first maybe 30 or 45 days? Is this why this united front crumbled so quickly? In your opinion, let me add to that.
Yeah, in my opinion, I think so, because I think at the beginning we were seeing a lot of different countries trying to identify and handle it at once, and then foreign actors taking advantage of certain weaknesses, in the US particularly at that time. and thereby, when people are terrified and when there's a lot of unknown and a lot of answers are needed, that disinformation can really spread because it can provide that emotional support and the answers people might be looking for as well.
Zachary, you work with pediatric patients with allergies and immunological challenges. What impact has the mixed messages and disinformation had when you're talking to patients and the parents who are advocating for them?
Right. So I've seen a lot of themes in my practice, but there's two that I want to bring up that I think are important to add to this discussion. One is that parents are concerned about the long-term effects of a relatively new piece of technology, as well as fertility issues, especially for females. So in terms of the long-term effects of vaccines, that's been discussed for decades, especially since Andrew Wakefield had published a paper in The Lancet trying to link MMR and autism together. That theme has been perpetuating for the past 20 plus years. In addition to that, there's been some misinformation earlier on when the vaccines were first coming out in January of 2021, talking about the risk of infertility, especially in women, which was thoroughly debunked. And yet, even today, this past week, I'm hearing from patients and their parents concerns about that.
Zachary, how do you have these conversations? How do you lead these conversations and bring people to a good place?
The first thing that I do is I ask them straight off the bat, what are your concerns about this vaccine and what are you hearing in your community, to set that table up so that I understand what types of misinformation that they're hearing, what are their specific concerns, and then I will try to tailor that conversation around whatever those needs are in the most thorough way as possible. Oftentimes I will have to write things out, diagram things out in the most simplistic terms as possible. Because these concepts can be rather complicated, we have to make sure that we're meeting them at the level that we are at in a non-judgmental and kind way. Oftentimes what we see on social media is a lot of combativeness and butting of heads when we talk about things, because when people know what's going on and they hear things that are emotionally based, oftentimes we all get heightened, and we have to bring that level of calm to the conversation and not be adversarial in order to meet people where they're at.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. Pax, moving in on this topic of like where disinformation and misinformation comes from, where we kind of teed this up with Lindsay, a little bit of current events today. Marjorie Taylor Greene, her personal account, was permanently banned from Twitter this morning for sharing COVID disinformation. Now, her supporters are claiming that all she did was share data from the VAERS database. What is VAERS, and what is it used for, and when is it useful, and when is it not useful?
Absolutely. So the VAERS system is the Vaccine Adverse Event Response or Reporting System. And essentially anybody, and I mean anybody from you and I, anyone on the panel to anyone in the audience, can go onto that system and they can file a claim or file a report. And so that all gets aggregated into a data set. So how it's not useful is that there are things ranging from I got the vaccine and was divorced the next day to I got the vaccine and developed alcoholism. There are things in there that just don't make sense. And anybody can look at that and say, that doesn't make sense. But the more concerning things are things like, I got the vaccine and then it caused death. Well, what most of the public does not understand is that there's a team at CDC that goes through each of those lines and they verify it and they look at it and they say, okay, let's investigate what's happening here. Was there a death? Yes, there was. A gentleman got the vaccine. He died the next day. Well, what you're not seeing in the VAERS data is that he had an addiction and he died of an overdose, or he had a car accident. So it wasn't directly related to the vaccine. So the way we would use it is we would take all of that data and we would scrub it. It's called data cleaning. And we would look at the things that were most important. So in the clinical trials, what were the adverse events for the Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J vaccines? Any event that happened after that, we would take that data and we would aggregate it and look and see if that data actually matched what was going on in the clinical trials. And then we would have threshold values to guide the public and the public opinion on the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. So it really does have use if you are trained in biostatistics and public health science, but beyond that, it's just a fun thing to look at. If you find looking at data fun. Donna, thank you for being so patient and for filling in for Ethan today. There's over 800,000 American families who have lost someone to COVID. Millions more are dealing with hospitalizations, fallout, long COVID, worried about their children, their work. The impact of this on the American psyche is very real. What can people do to help them cope with this isn't real and the disinformation message and the confusion and the anxiety that creates?
Abstract statistics don't mean much to lay people. So you say 800,000 or however many million that have been infected with COVID, and that is not going to have much impact. But personal stories mean a lot. So I urge those who have been sickened by COVID, people like Beth, those who have lost loved ones to COVID, to please speak up and share your story, because those stories are real. And that's what we do at the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We share personal stories about mental health in order to reduce the stigma. Tell people about your COVID experience. These personal stories will counter the disinformation and serve as cautions to those who deny COVID's existence and its dangers. There's a question posted in the chat about why are there more deaths worldwide since the public has received the vaccines? Well, there's a simple answer to that. More people have become infected. The variant has spread, and that's why more people have died or gotten sickened by the COVID virus. So again, it's rather than a simplistic answer of blaming it on one cause versus another, it's recognizing we have a virus epidemic and we have to deal with it. Thank you.
Donna, thank you for that. Melanie, I'm giving you probably the hardest question of this entire webinar panel discussion.
All right, I'm ready. Go for it.
How severe Omicron is compared to Delta is on everybody's mind. What does the current research and what do we know about Omicron tell us where we're at on January 2nd, 5:27 p.m. Seattle time?
All right. I do my best to stay up to date on all of this. And I talk to, the MDs that are on this panel and epidemiologists here, as well as many others. And what we can say right now is that we know that people who are double vaccinated and triple vaccinated are having less severe disease. Okay, so even if it's breaking past that initial antibody neutralization of the virus, you have another part of your adaptive immune response called T cells. And it's very hard for a virus to mutate its way out of T cell recognition, and they're going to suppress a lot of the major symptoms you're having. So even if people are showing up at the ER, if they're double or triple vaccinated, typically less severe symptoms and they get sent home, okay? What we're not sure about yet is the severity for the people who are unvaccinated and have not had COVID prior. There was early data out of South Africa, but that population isn't really comparable to ours. We can't compare it directly. That was a much younger population with different exposures to Delta. They just come off a major Delta wave with 70 to 80% of their population infected. The UK is more highly vaccinated than we are, and they're not really doing the best job of parsing out severity along vaccinated versus unvaccinated lines. So it's been difficult to tell from kind of leading indicators, countries that have been dealing with this for longer than we have, what's truly going on. So for now, it's just better not to get it, because what we can say is even if it's a little less severe than Delta, the original ancestral strain certainly caused a lot of problems for people like Beth. And I'm so glad she's here today sharing her story, because less severe than Delta doesn't mean better.
Thank you so much for that. And I see lots of nodding heads among our panelists there. Todd, when the Omicron variant was first announced, Dr. Angelique Coetzee from South Africa told the world it was, quote, very mild, unquote, and she had seen no hospitalizations. That was on November 27th, November 28th, November 27th, South Africa, November 28th for the United States. Buried past those headlines, her statement was based on seeing 24 people, mostly college students, half who were vaccinated in a non-hospital setting. How has that early message impacted the spread of disinformation? And this is why I gave you this question, because you are also practicing in medicine. What are you seeing?
Yeah, the problem with any statement is that we're on this 24-hour news cycle. And so everybody wants to get out ahead of the story and report what they hear. And clearly, you just heard from immunologists and epidemiologists. We just don't know. So sadly, we need to wait sometimes to get information to report it. But while we wait, somebody else is happy to share something. And what they used to say is in the media world was, if it bleeds, it leads. And sadly, in social media, if it scares, it's shared. And that's how it goes, because that's what gets you viral, going viral. So what I would say is it's created confusion. And as we are trying to provide the facts in a well thought out manner, it's not quick enough for some people. And I want to make one last quick statement. Everybody on this panel, I believe, scientists, epidemiologists, doctors, and survivors, get attacked for talking about this. We don't attack them. So that's kind of interesting. I hope we get to talk about that later.
We can probably interject that a little bit later in there, Todd, when we talk a little bit more about some of those topics. Hi, Natalie. Are you feeling lonely and forgotten over there? Yeah. I have not forgotten about you. When you got COVID a year ago, roughly, you were pregnant at the time and had decided to wait to get vaccinated. What role did mixed messages and disinformation play in that decision for you, now that you can look back a year?
So I was hospitalized from January 5th through March 16th. So the vaccines started rolling out while I was in the hospital. When I got out of the hospital, I knew I needed to get vaccinated, but everyone was calling it the clot shot. And I already had 4 blood clots from COVID. And I was so terrified, and I have bad PTSD anyway. So I ended up just going to the doctor, getting repeat scans, making sure my lungs, my heart, my blood clots were resolved. I mean, I just made sure that I was healthy enough to get them. All my doctors recommended them. So I waited 3 months to get vaccinated. And I did have a panic attack after the first one. I ended up in the ER because I knew I was going to die, because that's what everybody said was going to happen. I ended up being fine. I had the normal immune response with all 3 of my shots, fever, body aches, headache. It wasn't anything like what I seen on the internet.
And Natalie, I'm so glad that you were with us today, and thank you for sharing your story. And we're going to pause because I want to circle back to Todd. And you're a mom of 4.
Yes.
And so how old now is how old are your kids?
15 and a half, 4, and the little one turns 1 January 11th. He was born 10 weeks early.
And then you have another one that unfortunately was there was an issue with cancer. I just want to acknowledge your 4th child.
Yeah, he passed away when he was 5 with a terminal brain cancer.
I thank you again for sharing your story and for your bravery of being here today. I'm going to pause. We're going to come back to get kind of the part 2 of your story. Todd, on the subject of 10-month-olds and 4-year-olds, infants and although 4-year-old maybe, infants and toddlers can't effectively communicate what symptoms they have or why they feel sick. They're just really good at making sure that everybody around them know that they're miserable. What signs should parents be looking for in children who are nonverbal or have limited communication skills to kind of look at and go, you know what? I think I need to go see somebody.
Sure. Nonverbal, and particularly when we think of kids under 2 where they can't really describe what's going on, we have a limited set of things that we can go on. And parents should go with their gut, and they should always talk to their pediatrician, who should be available 24/7. But you look for things like eating, drinking, general behavior. Are they lethargic energy level, or are they acting themselves, right? So if you have a child who is unconsolable, or who is really lethargic, or who isn't eating well, or has other things are like abdominal distension. There's a few things, and then fever. Those are things that we look for that can be signs of infection that are worrisome to us. And particularly for any of those signs for a kid less than 2 months, you need to jump on that immediately. But for even kids over 2 months, if they're not acting the norm, particularly if they're not eating okay, drinking okay, can't be consoled, or can't be awakened easily, those are all things that are quite concerning. And if anything else pops up that's concerning, please call your pediatrician right away.
Todd, something that I've read is that particularly in smaller children under 5, severe lethargy is one of the red flags of they could have COVID. Is that something that you've heard, that you've read, that you're seeing? Or did I just contribute to the disinformation cyclone?
Well, I mean, we even heard Beth say that fatigue was a big part of her illness, and we know fatigue and lethargy can be. I can't say that I personally have seen that. A lot of the kids who are coming into our practice that are positive have been sore throat and some upper respiratory symptoms, but there's a range of presentation. And, thankfully, we haven't seen a lot of real severe illness in our practice, but when we talk to the hospital, we know that the admissions are going up. So we know the numbers are going up, and we know the kids are very sick are going up. But I can't say that there's one presentation I would look for. I would look for anything where your child's not acting themselves.
Thank you so much for that. Zachary, I've got a question. I want to lead a little bit because Melanie had talked about, we really can't look at South Africa and go, that's the way the United States is going to go. We can't look at the UK and say, that's the way that the United States is going to go. If we look at vaccination and we say, look at South Africa, they only started boosters on December 9th. They're not doing vaccination for children. UK decided not to vaccinate 5 to 11 years old. Here in the United States, the rate is very low. I saw 2 different numbers today. I saw 15% and I saw 17%. So I'm just going to toss the 2 numbers that I saw. Washington State, the last accurate data that we had, which is before the Christmas break, was 25% with the first dose and almost 18% fully vaccinated. What should parents know? Because there seems like there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy for the smaller children, and we're seeing by reports a bigger impact.
Absolutely. So those are accurate numbers basically across the country. And we're kind of hitting a wall with vaccinations amongst 5 to 11-year-olds. And we kind of knew that going in, unfortunately, because even though a lot of parents themselves got vaccinated, again, some of the concerns about long-term effects with vaccines are holding root there, plus this idea that the question of why does my child need a vaccine? And so trying to tackle that piece of information can be challenging to convince folks why it's so important to get vaccinated. And some of the key points that I try to tell people is this is not a benign virus. One of the things that I'm starting to see in my clinic is this issue of long COVID, where even kids are getting lingering symptoms for weeks, if not months. And we don't, as a scientific medical community, really understand the pathophysiology or the mechanism of that disease entity. It's most likely different types of presentations, different types of mechanisms. In my clinic alone, I'm seeing young children as young as 4 developing essentially asthma after COVID-19 infection. I'm seeing children getting chronic hives that last for 6 weeks or longer, which is a little bit unusual because most viruses that cause hives last only for a couple of weeks. I'm seeing some kids who develop chronic fatigue. And I'm also seeing kids older, 17, 18, 19, developing smell disorders. So these things can have lingering effects that we don't fully understand, which is the messaging that I know some of our panelists need to be able to speak more and more about, because those personal stories, I think, have a greater impact on parents and their families to understand why it's so important for even younger children to get a vaccine.
Todd, when Zachary was talking, I saw your head just nodding like crazy. So I'm going to just give you an opportunity. Do you want to add anything to that?
In terms of this?
No, Todd, I'm going to just see if Todd wanted to add anything to your answer, Zachary.
Yeah, no, we were seeing the exact same thing when we got the 5 to 11-year-old vaccines available and we announced it. I liken it to selling Bruce Springsteen tickets. People were jamming our phone lines and our portal computer lines. And when it was all said and done, we had 1,500 kids vaccinated, but then it plateaued. I mean, we have a couple hundred kids, probably about 100 or 200 kids a week now that are, it's just kind of slowly going up. Too slow.
Pax, on the subject of school and work, for a lot of people, work and school, it's back to reality tomorrow after kind of almost 2 weeks of a little something. What can people do to add additional layers of protection to themselves when they're going back into their place of business or their school, or their kids are going to school?
Yeah, absolutely. So really nothing has changed except a couple of things. So if you work in person, vaccination, the 2 shots of Moderna or Pfizer plus your booster are going to give you added protection. If you have not received your vaccine, please go get that. I encourage you to do so. If you've not been boosted, I also encourage you to do so. The CDC no longer recommends the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We are recommending a full dose of of one or the other of the mRNA vaccines. Masks continue to offer the best protection. So N95 and KN95 are the best. Cloth masks are also relatively ineffective. However, a double masking with surgical mask plus your cloth mask will provide a little added benefit, though KN95 and N95 are the best. Social distancing remains very important, as does hand washing and proper ventilation of home and business. For school, there's not really been any guidance thus far. Vaccinate your kids over 5. They are not able to get boosters as of yet. Masks, KN95 and N95 for children, social distancing, ask that your schools are ventilating the classrooms. That is also going to help. But this is a challenging question for a variety of reasons. Kids aren't stupid, but it's also unrealistic to think that they're going to keep their mask on and not going to fidget and not going to play with their friends, right? It's unrealistic to think of that. So it's really up to the parents. Shutdowns will have little impact at this point. So shutting down an entire school district may not be effective. Emerging research from Ohio State University has found that the more online instruction a student has, the less impactful it becomes. And students of color and low income status are oftentimes the ones who are greatly and disproportionately affected by that. So we do need to start moving back towards a in-classroom based environment, but we also have to remember that we're in the middle of a pandemic with a highly transmissible virus. So all of those things, when working together, will work. But bottom line, parents, you have to do what's right for your children. So please make the best decision that you can.
I think you brought up an important point that is very much in the lane of news that we coverage, which is when you do shutdowns of schools, there is this issue of inequity, particularly in the BIPOC community, and also in very rural areas where they may not have internet access at all. And so it becomes incredibly challenging for poor school districts, rural school districts, and mixed school districts to go, all right, everybody distance learning. I think you brought up an excellent point, and one of the challenges that public health and public education has in trying to balance all of that. Pax, you also talked about masks. I'm gonna circle back with you on why N95, KN95, why cloth. We're gonna circle back on that. Lindsay, I want to pull you in because you've been so patient. And one of the big points of major disinformation has been on the issue of masks. And something that you're very good at is walking people through in 2 minutes or less how mask bad all over social media ends up on news sites, and now millions of people are saying mask bad. Can you walk us through how that happens as somebody who has expertise in this space?
Yeah. So specifically with masks, and I know with that type of disinformation, I know it started from a foreign bad actor, namely Russia and China. And when they do that, looking at it from a more broader perspective, the whole idea is to cause a distrust in a public, in a government institution, or societal institution in some way. And public health falls into that societal institution category. And when you have disinformation, one of those key motivators is to cause that confusion and that distrust and that division within that institution. And then it kind of, for lack of a better comparison, spreads like a virus to other institutions. And so with what we're seeing now is, foreign and domestic actors utilizing that distrust and kind of taking hold of that. And with that, more disinformation is spreading, not just with the masks, but very other elements within the pandemic and with COVID-19. And with that distrust, we're having domestic actors propagate that and spread it further to their certain causes and advantages that then continues to fuel that foreign type of disinformation and cause that distrust and that division. And it causes just increased confusion again with that. And so having that distrust in that societal institution be squandered just helps continue that disinformation, and it helps continue that population believing in it. Unfortunately, I know that's not the best news with that, but yeah.
Todd, I'm going to ask you, are masks bad? I think you're muted, Todd.
I am. Yeah, masks work really well. They work against a variety of different respiratory pathogens. They've worked well previously as we've been studying COVID throughout the course. And it is something that is cheap, highly available, and kids down to age 2 wear them quite well. But again, with disinformation that's been pushed around and people politicizing this whole issue, while almost everybody that could was wearing them last year, all of a sudden they become a political hotspot, and again, yet another source for disinformation to be pushed out.
You had talked about cloth masks not working as well and really needing to go to KN95, KN94, N95. Why is the messaging changed around? Because this is a source of confusion. Why is the messaging changed?
Do you want me to take that?
That was for PAX. Sorry.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that question for me?
Yeah, I can repeat that question for you. The guidance has changed on masking, right? And you had mentioned earlier about you should have N95, KN95, KN94 comes up in conversations.
Sure.
But in earlier messaging, when they said, okay, wear masks, cloth masks were okay. What's changed? Why is the messaging keep evolving from a public health standpoint on mask wear?
Yeah, I think the belief that, it's been a real mess since the beginning when we hear things like, well, masks, we don't need masks, and then we do need masks. And there's been a lot of confusion on when to wear one and when not to wear one. And it became a political issue, not so much an issue of public health and public safety. So masks, we know, are not going to prevent us from getting sick. It's to prevent other people from catching it if we have illness. So masks aren't stopping that. So when we look at the N95, the way that it fits over, it's going to filter out 95% of any particulate that gets into the air. And so with that, The virus, I believe, is about 0.1 microns, and the N95 is going to filter out about 0.3. And so the argument is, well, that's too small. The virus is going to get out anyway. But it's on droplets, right? So when you speak, you're releasing saliva and moisture from your mouth. And so those masks are stopping that. They're filtering that and they're protecting you. Well, again, it comes down to disinformation and misinformation that wearing masks is an issue of freedom. And I hear what the people who say that, I hear them, but it's also my freedom not to get sick, right? So it's one of those things that I've always been very adamant about. Wear your mask and do your part, because at the end of the day, you are protecting not only yourself, but someone else. And so it's very frustrating to see that, more masks haven't been worn correctly and have really been politicized in the way they have.
Donna, I want to circle back to you, and I thank you for your patience. It's been a great conversation. We still have 40 minutes to go. We're here in Washington State on January 20th. We enter our third year of COVID, and we're going to school and we're going to work. And Donna, for some people, it's starting to feel a little dystopian. How can people manage long-term mental health when we're past the short-term solutions of take a social media break and bake yourself a loaf of bread to give yourself the taste of home?
Well, definitely COVID, economic disruptions, school closures, and the impact of these continuing waves of variants are all adversely affecting people's mental health. Anxiety and depression rates have doubled. Suicide attempts and deaths have risen dramatically among our youth. And so if you're feeling anxious or depressed or concerned, you are not alone. The sense of dystopia is widespread. But I take heart from the fact that coping strategies that are used by our folks who have mental health conditions can actually help the general population deal with disappointment, anxiety, uncertainty, and despair. One of our new board members, Richard Taylor Jr., has a saying, "We all have a mental health," which we all do. And so there are certain self-care strategies that can help all of us. Reframing our self-talk, change what we say to ourselves to be more positive and looking for things to celebrate rather than catastrophizing. Reframing our expectations of ourselves and others. How about delighting in small things and day trips rather than obsessing about the fact that we can't take a long trip or do some kind of big event. Maintaining a routine. We have control over certain things. Sleep, diet, exercise. Finding joy in the outside. Going into creative pursuits, art, music, crafts. Build something, film something, cook something. There are things that we can do to make ourselves feel more in control. This is a historic moment in our lives. We could start or maintain a journal about our experience and be able to talk to future generations about that. We can maintain connections with friends and loved ones. I have a brother and his family in London. I'm not going to go on a plane to see him, but I can FaceTime with him. I can talk on the telephone. I can email and I can text. We can get adequate rest because sleep deprivation makes everything look worse. We can avoid doom scrolling on our phones and our laptops and avoid getting sucked into the outrage that is sought by social media. So we can also engage in mindfulness and meditation, and there's been a lot more focus on that in the last year. But I want to close by paraphrasing Charles Darwin, who said that successful evolution and survival is determined by those who can adapt to changing conditions, not to the strongest or the smartest of a species. So I want to emphasize that flexibility and the willingness to adapt to changing conditions are what's going to take us through this pandemic.
Donna, I think that's great advice, and I appreciate that. Natalie, we've left the audience hanging. I want to go back. You said how you were admitted into the hospital in early January. You were in there for 70 days, and you were pregnant at the time. The floor is yours. Tell us your hospitalization story. And one other thing, and again, mild content warning for our audience, you were on a ventilator for 2 weeks, if I remember correctly?
Yeah, 15 days.
Yeah, and can you talk also, when you do that, a little bit about your experience on a ventilator? A lot of people are under the impression it's lights out, it's all good. I've been on a ventilator, not with COVID, and I know what my experience was, and it wasn't, it's lights out and it's all good.
So my lungs started failing within, I think, 5 or 6 days of contracting COVID. I felt like I was suffocating. My respirations were in the 40s. You know, they transferred me to a bigger hospital. We tried the high flow. We tried a BiPAP, and we decided that I needed to be intubated because I was still suffocating. Like, it didn't matter if my oxygen was 90%, I could not breathe. And so I was desperate to be intubated. I wanted to be sedated. I wanted to just wake up in a couple weeks, either healed here or in heaven with my son. Like, I just didn't want to suffer anymore. But that wasn't the case. When I was on the ventilator, you know, half the time I was having vivid nightmares of suffocating, and I was dying over and over. And I was restrained to the bed, I was paralyzed, and I was suffocating. And the noise that I was hearing in my nightmares was the sound of a ventilator. And I had never heard a ventilator before. So I came across a TikTok that had this sound, and it triggered me so bad because it was the sound from my nightmare, and it was the sound of a ventilator. So, you know, I was still suffering even when I was unconscious, which is why I have PTSD today. Is it was just traumatizing. I wish I could have just went to sleep and woke up fine, but that wasn't my experience at all.
Natalie, you've shared pictures in your social media channels where you had sores and bruises from all of this.
Yeah, so they laid me prone, which is on my stomach, for 18 hours a day. And it looked like they just left me there. But really, compared to other people, my pressure ulcers were not as bad as I thought they were. Half of my top lip actually came off, and I have a scar, and I have like some permanent like little marks all over me. I don't really know what those are from. I was alone when I was in the hospital. There was no visitors allowed. They wouldn't allow my husband to FaceTime me. So I don't know, you know, what the marks and stuff are from. But from what I've been told, my injuries were not near as bad as what they're actually seeing in the COVID ICUs. A lot of those patients don't come home. They don't get to, you know, post their pictures on social media. So when I post my pictures, I'm accused of being a crisis actress, you know, just being accused of lying about my injuries.
Thank you, Natalie, for that. Beth, I want to turn to you as our other COVID survivor, because it was stressed early on, the importance of hearing these stories. And long COVID doesn't get the recognition and the coverage. On July 26th in the United States, U.S. Health and Human Services, and I know you're in Canada, declared that long COVID is a disability under ADA. Tell us about your 21 months.
Yeah, it's funny because even sitting here, I'm having a hard time focusing I'm having a hard time keeping my tremors at bay. I actually have a facial tic that is getting worse and worse the more I get overstimulated very easily. So some neurological issues like that are ongoing symptoms. But what I've noticed is that my symptoms kind of got grouped into two categories. When I first started coming out of the virus, I had a lot of injuries from the virus. So I had costochondritis, I had a lot of weakness, I had lingering cough. I was coughing for 6 months. And, all of that was really still the virus kind of hanging on. But then I started to develop a whole range of new symptoms. So severe muscle pain, severe joint pain, migraines, brain fog. Like I said, I have tremors and severe CFS with post-exertional malaise, which basically means every day I have a set amount of energy. And if I do anything over that, I'll get sick the next day. So a great example is today I started to take down my Christmas decorations. I know if I took them all down in one day like I normally would, I would have flu-like symptoms tomorrow. Actually, because I did a little Christmas decor and I'm talking right now, I know tomorrow I'm probably going to be sick. So it's been this whirlwind of symptoms. I've been out of work. I didn't work for the first 4 months of being sick. Then I went back part-time. I'm senior director at a global financial institution. So I'm used to being in meetings, 10 hours a day, very high pressure, lots of customer interaction, lots of public speaking. And I've been out of work for the last 5 months. I'm actually going back in the next few weeks. So it's impacted absolutely every area of my life. I don't even recognize myself anymore. It's been very humbling.
And Natalie, on the subject of not recognizing yourself, one of the things that you talk about a lot as a survivor is your hair.
So in the hospital, I don't know if any of y'all follow my story, but I had a lot of complications. I had blood clots, foot drop. I was bedbound for a few months. And, during that time, my hair completely stopped growing. I was in the hospital for 70 days. I had highlights, my hair stopped growing completely. Within a few months, it all started falling out. I lost 75, which you can't tell now, but 75% of my hair fell out. And it's just now starting to grow back, which I'm really proud of. But I have lots of baby hairs. But
again, I can't say it enough. Natalie and Beth, I so appreciate that you're here. And I want to acknowledge again your bravery in sharing your stories. Melanie, I'm going to go back to you, and I'm actually going to go off script, but I know you can answer this question. We had an audience question come in. So
Sure.
If you have the script in front of you, you could just ignore that question.
I don't
The
have
question is, how do you test
Winging
for
it.
COVID? And I know you could explain how a PCR test works.
Yeah. I absolutely can. But first, I also want to acknowledge just what Beth and Natalie are talking about is this pathophysiology post-COVID that we don't fully understand, which myself as an immunologist, that's the reason why I'm kind of on the I don't want to get this train. And, thank you both for being here and sharing your story. It's incredibly moving. So how does PCR work? It's called polymerase chain reaction, and it amplifies whatever genetic material happens to be there. You start with a primer that matches either a virus, because we know the sequence of SARS-CoV-2, part of that virus, or influenza. It would have a different primer set. Or one of the diseases that PAX is working on in Southeast Asia, it would have a different primer set. We use this consistently for diagnostics in multiple diseases, okay? So once that primer set, which is very specific to that SARS-CoV-2 virus, sticks to it, you then amplify that gene, and then you can run that genetic material in what we call a gel, and then you visualize it directly. And there's either a band or there's not a band. And when people start talking about cycle times, it's just how many times you do that amplification process. So hopefully that was a good enough explanation. If there are any questions in there, yep, go for it.
It was good, absolutely, and very much appreciated. Pax, we're seeing already a national impact from COVID. Particularly, I think the most visible one that people are seeing is air travel, right? It has become a dumpster fire. Some of it's weather driven, but every airline is saying we have so many employees that are sick. And the FAA said yesterday, we may have to start throttling flights back because so many air traffic controllers are sick. If you, as an epidemiologist, were advising an employer, what would you tell them tonight about getting ready for January and February?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And, employers need to be aware that if they can open, or if they open up when they can have their workforce working from home. I know pilots and air traffic controllers can't do that. But they need to be prepared for the long-term and short-term effects that they have on their employees. For those essential workers, right, the doctors and nurses and the air traffic controllers, firefighters, police, EMS, they need to be prepared to, they really need to be prepared for some tough times ahead. They're going to have shortages. They're going to have people who cannot come to work, certainly can't come to work sick. There's nothing more irresponsible for an employer than to require an employee who is sick to come to work. There's absolutely nothing more irresponsible than that. If you have healthy employees working in air traffic control or 911 dispatch, and you have an infectious person at peak of their infection coming in and sick and answering phones and interacting with others in the office, there's no reason for that. So employers need to be prepared to ask their employees to stay home and continue that. We've all been working double duty. We've all been working very hard and long hours. I know that I'm averaging 16 hours a day between my COVID response and strike team response duties. And I'm tired and I don't want to do it anymore. I really don't. And I don't want to be in this career sometimes, but I know how important it is and I know the impact I have on people. So I'm going to tough it out. But if I get sick, I know better than to go into work. Even if it wasn't COVID, I wouldn't go in. So everyone out there listening, if you are sick and your employer is asking you to come in, please make the right decision for you. I know that's not always feasible, but do not give this to other people if you don't have to.
Donna, there's a lot of scary and confusing headlines. Families are, even if they're trying to insulate their kids, right? These conversations are filtering in. With kids starting school this week, almost across the entire United States and certainly here in Washington, how do you bridge these conversations?
Well, families can talk about what they can control and what they can't control, which is other people. But they can also talk about risk tolerance and mitigation measures and prioritizing what's important to members of the family and what is less important. So for example, going to work and going to school is usually considered pretty darn important. And as long as you're healthy, you prioritize your ability to be able to do that. Going to concerts, large events, bars and parties might be less important and have to be put off to times when the pandemic is not spreading. So there are mitigation measures that some of our medical folks have talked about that reduce our ability to be infected. Wearing a mask when you're around people other than your immediate family. Socializing outside, going for a walk, a bike ride, skiing, skating, rather than being indoors. Getting vaccinated and boosted, quarantining if you feel any symptoms. There is a fatigue with COVID mitigation, and we have to address that fatigue because it's not over yet. And workplaces can adapt to these changing conditions. There are many different types of work and environments that can go remote or hybrid in order to reduce exposure. Some employers are using staggered work schedules, online meetings, this webinar, for example, improving ventilation, improving sanitation, physical distancing of workstations, use of plexiglass, reduction in travel expectations for employees, doing telehealth. There are any number of items that both employers and schools can do to reduce exposure. A number of schools are now using what's called quarantining in place so that kids don't have to be sent home and they can continue to be able to be in-person instruction. I will point out that all of the NAMI Eastside support groups and classes have been held online since March of 2020. These support groups are continuing to go strong. Our classes are continuing to be full and helpful to people. And our staff are working in a hybrid mode so that we can respect people's different health needs and risk tolerances. I will also point out that we gave the staff the entire week between Christmas and New Year's off as a paid vacation because we knew that they were exhausted with dealing with everyone's mental health needs. So that's another example where both employers and schools can recognize when people have reached their limits.
Thank you so much for that. Melanie, you're going to get the second to last question before we go into the speed round and the Q&A.
Awesome.
We've lost some of our therapeutics, convalescent plasma, monoclonal antibodies from Regeneron and Eli Lilly. They don't work against Omicron. Why is that? And how come Sotrovimab and Paxlovid appear to be so much more effective when these other tools aren't?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said in the beginning, it's a highly mutated version of the virus, and Regeneron's antibodies, the monoclonal antibody cocktail of two monoclonal antibodies, bound very well to that receptor binding domain, that top of the spike protein that binds to the cell and allows the virus entry into the cell. And so those actually physically blocked virus entry into the cell. So that area has been so highly mutated now that those antibodies just don't bind as well anymore. Convalescent plasma lost efficacy kind of early on. It did work, and people were trying to use it for a bit, and then it kind of slowly went by the wayside. And so that is, it's a big blow to our toolbox that we have, even if you're, triple vaccinated, but immunocompromised, now we may not have monoclonal antibodies that help keep you out of the hospital. So people should be very aware of that and take, note of what Pax is saying about mask wearing being very effective. That is a tool that we still have that does block respiratory viruses. So that's why it doesn't work, but these Sotrovimab, oh boy, I said it wrong right on the Zoom, but it's from GlaxoSmithKline, and that's their particular antibody. It binds to a different area of the spike protein that wasn't quite as mutated. So it has lost a little bit of efficacy, as you might expect, but it is still being used. And there's not much of it though. And that's the problem, is that it's difficult to make large stocks of monoclonal antibodies. It takes time, it's expensive. So there's some of it out there, but people are running out quickly. So I would suggest no one relying on that being there for them. Now, something like Paxlovid, it's two different protease inhibitors, and it disrupts viral replication. And so that is very difficult for a virus to mutate its way out of, because it's two different ones. And so that one's going to work for a while. And I'm not sure if anyone knows, I'm not a prescriber. I don't prescribe drugs. So I'm not sure if anyone knows what the stocks are of that or if it's readily available. So maybe someone else could take that for me.
So on Paxlovid, what I understand is the United States is getting 265,000 or 300,000 total doses for January.
So that's not a lot, you guys. Don't rely on that being there.
How about molnupiravir? I hope I said that right. I haven't
molnupiravir. Yeah, I had to practice it too.
Shield.
Yeah, molnupiravir is Merck's answer to the antiviral that Pfizer was developing. Pfizer did a protease inhibitor. Merck did a nucleoside mimic. It's basically something that looks a lot like an RNA molecule, but shifts its structure around a little. So as the virus is replicating, it creates so many mutations, not just a couple that would lead to some weird escape version, but it actually so heavily mutates the virus that it can't form a functional virus. And so that's been really effective in Merck. Only, sorry, not really effective, not as effective as Paxlovid is what I meant to say there. About 30% effective at keeping people out of the hospital. It's not, great, but it's better than nothing. And so that's another tool that we have. And then EvoShield, much like some of the other antibodies that we've seen, their data does indicate that they've lost efficacy. And so it's still being used in treatment, and a little bit of that remains to be seen.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to have one last question. We're going to go to a speed round. It'll be just like your 30-second little closing sound bites, and then we're going to get to the audience questions. Natalie and Beth, what would you say to someone who just dismisses COVID? It's just the cold. It's just the flu, as people who have survived it.
Beth, do you want to go first?
Sure. That's a hard question to answer without getting upset, just because it's hard to describe how much it's changed my life. But with a cold, I've never been in bed unable to move for 3 months. This literally took everything in me to fight. I've never experienced anything like this. And post-viral illness aside, just my initial bout with the illness, which again was considered mild because I was unhospitalized, it was one of the hardest things I've ever been through, and in no way is anything like a flu.
So my husband actually did have a cold-like symptoms. Like, he had a stuffy nose, and we didn't even realize that he was sick until I started coughing my head off, and then my lungs started failing. It was the exact same strain. It just affected us differently. So if someone says it's just a cold, they're lucky that it was just a cold for them, but they need to be thinking about how it's going to affect somebody else. Like, my husband was off for 7 months. We lost 7 months of income because he was waiting for me to regain my strength and be able to walk and take care of our kids before he could go back to work. So just because it's a cold for you doesn't mean it's going to be a cold to somebody that appears to be young and healthy. But that's what I would say.
Natalie, Beth, thank you so much for that. We're going to go into our lightning round. I'll just ask our panelists, 30 seconds. Todd, we're going to start with you. There's a growing concern that hospitals across the United States will be overwhelmed. What can we do to flatten the curve when the curve is going straight up on the y-axis?
Yeah, all the things that you've heard Donna and Melanie and Zach and everybody have talked about is mitigation measures. So masking, vaccinating, boosting, not going into crowded situations that are unnecessary, all the things that we keep hearing, that's straight public health mitigation measures, and we should follow them.
Lindsay, 3 tips for people to go, wait a minute, is that misinformation?
Yeah, the first one would be if it evokes an emotion in any way, you need to take a step back and see, look further at it. 2, if there's sensational language in there, like if it's all in caps or if the sensational language is also evoking an emotion, take a step back and look at it. And then the third would be, is the source credible? What's the source of the information, and can you verify it and corroborate it through other means as well?
Beth, how can medical professionals better serve people who have long COVID?
2 ways. First, believe us, believe that long COVID is in of itself a diagnosis. And second, recognize that a lot of us will go through test after test, and our tests are going to come back completely clean. I look super healthy on paper, but what I need someone to stand beside me and help usher me into the world of chronic illness. I need support on how to manage my symptoms. We know there's no cure. We know we don't know the biology behind what's happening to me, but we know that there are mitigation strategies that I can use to help with my pain, to help with my energy stores, just to help manage day to day, because that's going to give me hope instead of saying, long haulers, we don't know what to do with you.
Thank you so much for that. Natalie, you have a 4-year-old and a 15-year-old. So you have a little one that's coming up to be eligible to be vaccinated. What would you say to somebody who's been watching this webinar and is on the fence?
My 15-year-old got vaccinated when I did, and she tolerated it fine, which she also had a mild case of COVID back in October. My 4-year-old will be getting vaccinated before she starts public school. And I would just tell the parents that are on the fence, as somebody who's lost a child before, you have the opportunity to prevent your child from dying from this illness. I would take it. I mean, it's safe and effective, and it's just so important to, protect our children.
Thank you for that. Donna, what is the, you know what, I need to step back and get some help sign that somebody should be looking for real quick?
Please don't wait until then. Don't wait until you're in crisis mode. If you are feeling anxious or feeling down or feeling isolated, reach out for support and resources. Go to www.nami-eastside.org and find out about our support groups, our classes. We have a youth ambassador program for middle school and high school students to talk about mental health issues. We have Ending the Silence presentations. We have a lot of programs and resources that can help people. Please don't try to escape your feelings through substance use or other methods. Do it the healthy way, and seek for community and connection, and we will all get through this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Pax, you've been so patient. We haven't talked to you for a while. Science and public health seems to always take a back seat to politics and commerce. You're in the field, speaking generally, not as somebody representing the state of Colorado. What should people be telling their elected leaders?
Public health, not politics. Public health saves you every day. The air you breathe in your home is due to public health measures. The roads that you drive on are maintained because of public health. The food you eat in restaurants and that you get from stores, public health. We are in so many areas and you don't even realize it. So politicizing public health and making it a weapon, a political weapon, only hurts you, the public, not the political operative or the political campaign. So public health, not politics. Please remember that.
Melanie, in the end, do we all get Omicron and then that's it? We've defeated COVID? What happens next?
You saved the best questions for me. Okay, so everyone please chime in if you'd like to. It's so highly contagious. It's going to be very difficult to avoid. Donna had some great mitigation measures. I know at our place of work, we actually moved to shift work. You are only there if you need to be there. Massive HEPA filters, mask wearing is required. And our employees, no one has gotten sick on the job, knock on wood so far. So, it can be done safely. And we also restrict anyone who's feeling sick from coming in. We do not allow that. Very important. So it can be done safely. You can, mitigate your risk. You can minimize your risk. But, I'd like to say to everyone here listening that, it's so contagious that if you do come down with Omicron, it's, not likely something you did or a mistake you made, and you shouldn't feel guilty about it. It is highly contagious, one of the most contagious viruses, it seems, and we'll get updates about that we've had to deal with in our lifetimes. So it is, very likely that a vast majority of the population will be exposed to this. The vaccinated are already faring a bit better than the unvaccinated. So, hopefully, more people will get vaccinated and will get their boosters, and we can, protect our health for the long term. What happens in the end? This is not a quick question, sorry. it's a big one. It's a doozy. So what happens in the end, we have four major coronaviruses that circulate throughout our population. And eventually, I think all of us will be exposed to the antigen either through vaccination, which is the safer way to do it, or through multiple infections, which is certainly not the safer way to go about this. And eventually we will have some immunity built up, so it won't be quite as bad. However, viral surveillance, I think, will always need to be part of the picture because it is such a virulent coronavirus.
Zachary, I saved you for last. As somebody who sees your content, I know that you can make things that aren't very good sound really good. So, Zachary, tell us something good.
Well, something fell in my lap recently that I think is really good news to share. If you haven't heard it already, it's combining human ingenuity with the ultimate amount of kindness, because one of the biggest problems in this pandemic is global vaccine inequity. In order to have the world be safe, for everybody to be safe, we have to get as many people vaccinated as possible. And that's not an easy task when parts of the world don't have these deep freezers to store things like the Pfizer vaccine. The resources are not there yet. While the United States and the European Union have promised several hundred million doses, something recently amazing happened. And that was at Texas Children's Hospital. They announced that they have developed a vaccine called Corbavax, which they've already promised 300 million doses to places around the world, low middle income countries that don't have easy access. They're using technology that is similar to the hepatitis B vaccine that's been around for multiple decades, nothing really new, and they're giving it without stand-up profit. They're giving the intellectual property away. They're not standing to make a profit off of this. They already have 150 million doses ready, and they're able to produce 100 million per month, which is truly a fascinating story and one that should give us hope that there is kindness and goodness in this world that'll help us turn the tide in this pandemic.
Thank you so much for that. And now we are going to go ahead and move to the Q&A portion of this webinar. And we have a ton of questions that have come in, and we are going to try and go through as many of them as quickly as possible. Panelists, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start throwing questions out there. I can see all your smiling faces at the top of the screen. If you see me looking down in the webinar, it's because my screen is down below me here. I'm going to be looking like for waving hands or nodding heads, and I'm going to be tossing them out based on that. So with that, our first question is from Kelly. Her question is, do you believe with proper mask, ventilation, and vaccines, we can keep our kids in school? Someone's gotta. All right, Todd's got his hand up. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you've heard what we've said here is that there are real benefits to being in school and to do so as safely as possible. So if kids can be vaccinated, if kids that are eligible can be boosted, if people wear masks, if they're spaced, that's about as safe of an environment that you can be in. That certainly by no means means that it's entirely safe. Everything outside of your bubble, outside of your home, is a level of risk. The question is it acceptable risk?
Todd, thank you for that. We've got another question from Stella. I actually think this is a good one for a number of our panelists. In the politicized nature of the pandemic, especially where large groups of Americans refuse to take minimum safety measures, are we almost guaranteed multiple mutations to continue?
So I'll kick this one off with a quick answer. You know, it's a numbers game. How many times the virus replicates and the level of virus within a person really, can portend a number of mutations from happening. So when you have a more highly vaccinated population, it's less likely you will get mutations. However, so many people will be infected at the same time that this has increased the likelihood of this occurring.
Does anybody, I saw a lot of nodding heads when I asked that. Does anybody else want to jump in? Lindsay, also, do you want to jump in on the disinformation front?
Yeah, I'll add a few things. I know that what I've noticed actually specifically on social media is that every time a new virus or a new mutation comes out, people go straight to end of the world doomsday talk on it. And I try to remind people, I think it's really important for people to recognize that once a mutation comes out, and any of the scientists and doctors can correct me if I state this wrong, we don't normally have the information available right then and there. It's going to take weeks or months even to get the full scope of that impact. And so it's just important to not go straight to fear or anger or anything like that, and just to wait until that information comes in and continue to take the best precautions, because it's in those moments where that fear can lead to more disinformation to be spread.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. There's a question here. It's from an anonymous person, and it's a very, I told our health experts on here there would be no direct, I want you to diagnose for me. So it's a very high level question. They're saying they had COVID a month ago. They were fully vaxxed. It's been a month. They still have a cough and they're still feeling very fatigued. At what point should they, you know what, I probably need to see somebody to talk about this?
They should go see someone now, honestly. If it's been that many weeks, we're getting to something called a chronic cough. We're getting close to that. And so that needs to be evaluated.
I see a lot of nodding heads to that. Thank you. I have another kind of general question here. How is this, and I don't know if this is the right one, and if our panelists are just like, I can't answer this. How is this impacting organ transplants with the issue of the immunocompromisation and surgeries being pushed off, and what's going on in that space? I see a lot of not its. So I appreciate the question, but as I said, I don't think that that was the right one for our panelists. There's a question about distribution on EvaShield. Am I saying that right? Is it EvaShield or EvaShield?
I believe it's EvaShield.
EvaShield, okay. I actually, because I was looking this up for a story, so that's the only reason that I'm going to jump in and say I know the answer to this. The United States is going to be getting about 700,000 doses. As I understand it, there are only a handful of doses that are available this week, and I stress handful. Those doses are going to be distributed equitably to the states through Health and Human Services, like the other monoclonal antibodies. What had happened during the Delta wave, it was kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet. 6 states used up 70% of the monoclonal antibodies in 6 weeks, and it left states like Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington in a very bad place because there was no supply for them. So I hope that answers that question. And again, I'm just going through them in chronological order. It's like, I know the answer to that one. Another question is, I'm kind of reading these questions as they go through here. It's just like, it's either, and I appreciate some of the questions that are coming in from people, it's just some of them, they're either not in the lanes of our panelists or they're too specific for us to answer. And I know some people are asking about their particular cases here. Here's another question coming from somebody who is Amy. What advice do you have for those who are immunocompromised or have an immunocompromised household member? And how do they navigate the COVID world?
I can answer some of that. So one of the challenges is that there's a group of people who feel like they're left behind in a lot of these changes in the CDC guidance with shortening isolation times, which may increase the risk of transmission, namely those who are immune compromised. And I've worked with many patients who have very rare conditions called primary immunodeficiency diseases. These are people who cannot mount an immune response based on a genetic mutation. They're essentially born with it or they develop it later in life. That's very different than HIV. Those patients oftentimes during COVID have had to stay home during the entire pandemic, relying on other people to be physically distant from them, and everybody wearing masks, having good hand hygiene, and getting vaccinated to protect them. That's what the whole idea about herd immunity or community immunity is about, is that we're trying to protect everybody who cannot get vaccinated as well. So that's what everybody in this panel has been talking about as a public health crisis. You're protecting those individuals. So people who have those types of family members in their household have to do all of those mitigation strategies as much as possible in order to reduce the risk for them.
Does anybody else have anything to add? I know we're kind of running over time. 2 more questions, and then I'm going to call it. Next question, when are boosters expected to be authorized for 12 to 15-year-olds? I know a lot of you have been talking about this on your channel, so that's why I'm going to toss that question out.
The FDA is expected to approve them tomorrow, and then CDC should approve within 2 weeks.
Thank you, Pax. Last question I want to put out is in response to some comments that are going on in the primary chat. One of them being that vaccine makers are shielded from any liability in any lawsuit from vaccine injuries. And I know that that is not a true statement. Who wants to talk about the vaccine injury program that is run by the federal government? Or can anybody talk about it? All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and say the little bit that I know. There is a vaccine injury program that is run by the federal government. There is a long list of vaccines that are included on that, including the COVID vaccine. There have been over 3,000 people, the last I looked, that have made claims on that, claiming they have looking for monetary compensation for vaccine injuries on there. So it's simply just not a true statement that COVID manufacturers, that there is absolutely no liability or recourse if you suffer a legitimate vaccine injury. And part of applying for that compensation is providing the medical evidence that you've had a valid medical injury. I think with that, we are going to go ahead and wrap up the Q&A portion of our webinar. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. I especially want to thank the expertise that we've got from Todd, from Melanie, from Zachary, from Pax, from Lindsay, and Donna. I want to really thank our survivors for coming here and sharing their stories today. Thank you so much, Natalie and Beth, for your bravery and courage. I'd like to thank our mods and admins for all of the work that they have done today in managing all of the questions and everything else that has been coming through during this webinar. And with that, I want to go ahead, as I said, and thank also all of our panelists, and a special thank to our supporters and patrons of Malcontent News, especially our purple, gold, and silver patrons. To remain truly independent, we do not accept advertisers, nor do we cross streams with any of the with business interests within Baden Hill Group. Without the support of our patrons and donations, we would not be able to bring you the content that we shared today. If you want to support independent media, you can find us on Patreon at The Malcontent. This webinar will be available for on-demand replay later this week, and we will be sending all registered and attendees an email when it is available. If you're a member of the press, a county or national public health organization, and want to contact one of our panelists with a media inquiry, you can send an email to media@malcontentment.com. That's media@malcontentment.com. This concludes our webinar, and Malcontent News thanks you all for joining us today.